that key nations of the world did everything that they could do to try to keep the kinds of changes associated with technological revolution out of their countries. Many nations made it very difficult to deal with the internet, to get on the internet, to gain access to what was happening in the world. Those regimes that have been founded upon control of information, trying to control information that their people receive, have been particularly troubled by the revolution in communication technology. And we're seeing the results today as we look around the world. There's absolutely no question that traditional top-down regimes where decision-making and power is concentrated at the top have become increasingly difficult to sustain in the face of the technological revolution that the world has experienced over the last 25 to 30 years. I think we're seeing it in the Middle East now, as we are watching governments being toppled and revolutions happening through the use of cell phones and demonstrations being orchestrated and organized and managed from incredible distances. We are seeing military engagements without engagement. We are seeing the use of drones that are controlled from thousands of miles away, pinpointing targets. And so warfare itself and the death and destruction that goes with it have become somewhat impersonal, as more often than not, people have been shielded from confronting face-to-face the death and destruction that is associated with military conflict. I think that's one of the things that those who enjoy so much studying America's Civil War have recognized. That, you know, if you can envision the Civil War where the forces of the Confederacy and the Union were coming toward each other from opposite sides of an open field for combat, and people were forced to face eyeball to eyeball, if you will, their opponents in open conflict, and how technology has made it possible to inflict incredible amounts of violence and devastation, and at the same time have protected, shielded the people from the results of their actions. And I know that people have talked about this with the dropping of the atomic bombs in Japan at the end of World War II. That the bomb was dropped and the plane took off, and the people in the plane that actually dropped the bomb really did not have to see the devastation that these bombs had created. And so we're seeing more and more of this today, and it's changing the face of the planet. It's changing the nature of the nation state. It's changing how we govern and all the rest of it. So I think all of it is incredibly important. I think so much of what the Constitution of the United States is about and means is occurring in these decisions being reached and argued in the Supreme Court of the United States. It seems like almost on a weekly basis, as the news media itself primes itself for some of these major decisions that the court is going to be responsible for making. With that, I'd like to introduce a topic which is directly related to this, and it is the issue of diversity. More specifically, the issue of pluralism. the challenge of governing in a diverse or pluralistic environment. This past weekend, in the New York Times, Thomas Friedman wrote a piece in favor of American pluralism. And what prompted his article, as much as anything, was the vote taken at the end of last week in Scotland about separating from the United Kingdom. And as you know, when the vote was taken, the voters of Scotland overwhelmingly voted to stay connected, to remain within the United Kingdom. And there was a worldwide sigh of relief, not only from the officials of the United Kingdom, but officials around the world, including the United States, because we know that Great Britain is America's principal ally in today's world. And to stand back and watch the voters of Scotland choose to sever a key portion of the United Kingdom through the ballot box was something that nobody relished, because, you know, people wondered what the overall impact would be, not so much on Scotland as on the United Kingdom and the world politics that would be directly affected by it. So I became particularly interested in Friedman's piece and particularly interested in this particular topic. Tom Friedman doesn't hide his preferences here. He entitles his piece, "Three Cheers for Pluralism Over Separatism." And he points out that Scotland is not the only place that is experiencing separatist tendencies. Of course, we know about the situation in Canada and French Canadians. And frequently there's talk about separation of Quebec from the Canadian Commonwealth. And then, of course, there's Spain, and Friedman speaks about Spain. And Spain also is witnessing the challenge of separatism. And in the course of his article, Friedman gives reference to an institute that exists, that was created early in this century at Harvard University, namely a pluralism project under the direction of one Diana Eck. And so based on this issue and based on the issue of pluralism and its importance to governance, I spent some time looking at the website of the Pluralism Project at Harvard University. And to be very honest with you, I found it to be incredibly informative. Again, there is absolutely no question that the degree to which Madison and some of the other framers would be correct in their predictions that Republican government in America would be doomed by the kinds of demographic changes that were taking place in the nation during the 18th and 19th and 20th centuries. All of that is contingent on the ability of the nation to deal with the diversity within it. I spent a little bit of time in my history class this morning talking just about this. We've been dealing principally with colonial America. And the issue of diversity versus community is a key theme throughout the colonial period. There is absolutely no question. Because dependent on the particular circumstances that one confronts, there is a direct response, a direct impact on the issue of governing itself. For example, when the original Puritan settlers settled in Boston in the 1630s, they came here believing that they were God's chosen people. They were unified. In terms of religion, there was no diversity. Practically speaking, they were all in sync. This was a perfect community in the ideal sense of the term. Consequently, governing that community required that man's laws, man-made laws, conform to what were perceived to be God's laws. The assumption was that the government of this community were in fact the agents of God who were called to divine, to design, and to implement laws, man-made laws, which were totally consistent with the laws of God. And of course, the Puritan fathers believed that only certain people were qualified to know what God's law was. And these were the so-called saved, what the Puritans called the saints, those that they believed God had predestined to be saved. They were church people. And it stood to reason that as church people, receiving special graces from God to know God's will, they naturally were the ones best qualified to design man's laws in conformity with God's laws. So while there was religious freedom, and John Winthrop, the governor, speaks incessantly about freedom, about liberty in this kind of an environment, and he defines liberty as the right to do that which is good, just, and honest. Translation: you are free to do what the law allows. You are not free to do otherwise. And Winthrop defines doing otherwise as natural liberty. Man's innate human nature taking over. And Winthrop equates this kind of liberty with the liberty that animals and brute beasts of the woods and fields have. The right to do whatever you want. And Winthrop makes the point that this kind of freedom, the right to do whatever you want, is inconsistent with authority. It's inconsistent with organized society. It's inconsistent with God's plan. And it must be prevented. Consequently, these people came here to practice religion, to practice worshiping God as they wanted to do it, but they were unwilling to extend religious freedom to anybody else. You were free to conform. If you didn't conform, you were expected to leave. You would be banished from the colony. Anne Hutchinson, Roger Williams, these people whose ideas conflicted with the established teachings of the colony, these people were banned, were expelled from Massachusetts. Quakers were hung. So this is the kind of community without pluralism. In other words, there is no pluralism allowed. There's no room for pluralism in this kind of a community. But when you move into another situation where you have more than one religion within the same confined area, within the same colony, and I'm thinking specifically of Maryland here. Maryland was originally designed to be a haven for Catholics who were being persecuted in England after the Protestant Reformation. Lord Baltimore was a Catholic, and Lord Baltimore believed that he could use his influence and the debt that the crown owed his family to be granted a colony in the New World which would become a refuge for Catholics. And that really was the basis of the establishment of the Maryland colony, the charter given to Lord Baltimore for the colony of Maryland. But it wasn't too many years after Maryland was founded in the 1630s that the Catholics in Maryland found themselves to be in a distinct minority. Most of those who ended up settling in Maryland were not Catholic. Consequently, the proprietor, Lord Baltimore, faced a challenge. What could he do in order to ensure that the Catholic minority in Maryland did not end up being oppressed just as they were in England prior to the time they came to Maryland? Lord Baltimore addresses this in the mid-1640s with an act for religious toleration. And basically what the act said was that nobody who accepted Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior and abided by the civil laws of the colony of Maryland, the proprietor's laws, would be required to practice any particular religion or would be molested in any way for the practice of religion. If you were a Christian, Catholic or Protestant, under this law, your religion was to be tolerated. Your differences were to be tolerated, as long as you abided by the rules of the colony. So what we have in Maryland is religious freedom, in quotes, if you were a Christian. Obviously, Lord Baltimore's strategy was the only optimum one he could reach. By securing toleration in Maryland as a minority, that was the most that Catholics could hope for at the time. And then later in the 17th and the early 18th century, we have Pennsylvania. And Pennsylvania, as we know, is envisioned by its proprietor, William Penn, to be a Quaker colony, because William Penn was a Quaker. In order to recruit settlers to Pennsylvania, because William Penn realizes very quickly that there's no gold and silver mines like the Spanish were able to find in Central and South America. And Penn recognizes very quickly that if Pennsylvania was to become profitable, it was going to be based on wealth that people produced. It was going to take settlers, a lot of settlers, to turn Pennsylvania into a paying proposition. Consequently, William Penn, which is very consistent with his Quaker heritage, William Penn in 1701 issues a Charter of Liberties, which lists a number of freedoms, individual freedoms, that citizens living in Pennsylvania can expect from the proprietor. And one of them is the right not to be harassed over your religion. And in the particular language of the Charter of Liberties, William Penn says, as long as you believed in a supreme being who was the ruler of all things, and as long as you abided by the civil laws of the colony, you would not be penalized, you would not be molested for what you believed. In other words, it was much closer to religious freedom than either Maryland or Puritan Massachusetts. Because when William Penn extended religious freedom to all who wanted to come to Maryland, he ended up with a wide-ranging smorgasbord, quilt, if you will, of different religious groups: Dutch Reformed, Mennonites, Anglicans, Catholics, Jews, and increasingly Methodists and later Baptists as we get into the 18th century. It's very obvious that governing that kind of a situation meant that religion had to be off the governing table entirely, because anything that government did which smacked of a particular religious denomination would create an uproar from all the others. So the wide diversity of religious demographics in Pennsylvania demanded what we call the separation of church and state. It was absolutely vital in order to govern in this kind of a situation. It was absolutely vital that you totally separate government from religion. Because religious freedom becomes the lure, the attraction that brings people to colonial Pennsylvania and makes Pennsylvania a paying proposition. The issue in each of these three cases is the degree to which government must be able to adapt to the demographic situation it faces in its challenge to govern. The circumstances, the demographic circumstances, drive the relationship between religion and politics, religion and government in each of these areas. What I'm trying to say here is that the adaptability that James Madison talked about in 1829 in order to sustain the republic is the kind of adaptability we're talking about here in the earliest of the colonial period in America. Obviously, the challenge at this time was religious. The diversity was principally religious. And the challenge for government was to govern in sometimes very pluralistic, diverse situations. And it was those situations that dictated how government governed, specifically in the areas of religion. The Pennsylvania model, with the wide diversity, becomes particularly important and insightful for those seeking to understand American history that happens later. The diversity of Pennsylvania tends to become the model for governing the nation at large. And many of the strategies which are developed in Pennsylvania during the colonial period to govern a pluralistic, diverse population are the same strategies that are employed in the Republic, that are employed in the constitutions that are written in 1776 with America's decision to declare its independence. The Continental Congress sends out word to the 13 colonies in July of 1776 that the colonists, that Congress on June 6th passed a resolution sponsored by Richard Henry Lee that these colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. And Congress instructs the colonies, as a consequence, to write their own constitutions. And the nature of those constitutions is driven in large part by the demographic nature of the colony within which they are written. The circumstances for government drive to a tremendous degree the extent to which the Constitution must defer to the demographic realities which government must face in order to govern effectively. It's that kind of logic, that kind of thinking, that kind of common sense, it seems to me, that one must give the framers at the time that they drafted the Constitution of the United States. To assume that the framers were so short-sighted as to believe that the world they were looking at in 1787 would be a world that would never change. To believe that is to do a tremendous disservice to the founders, because everything they did and everything they were about suggested that they were much more insightful and intelligent than that. I would suggest, and the point that I was making here at the Virtual Center last week when we were looking at the Noel Canning case in the Supreme Court, is that there's no question that Madison is correct in 1829. The viability, the very existence of the Republic itself is going to be determined by the Constitution's ability to adapt to changing circumstances. Consequently, from the very beginning, the Constitution of the United States was envisioned by the framers as a living document. And consequently, the originalist argument of Antonin Scalia and earlier Robert Bork suggests an effort to go back to a period that no longer exists if it ever did. I think that the ongoing controversy between originalism and the idea of a living constitution has been effectively resolved by the founders themselves in the person of James Madison. And if you look at the history of the early republic, the colonies prior to the Declaration of Independence, you can begin to see the extent to which government was always at the ready to adapt to the demographic circumstances in which it found itself. I think one would be hard-pressed to argue anything different. With that, what I'd like to do, we have reached the top of our first hour. It's 2 p.m. in the East on this Monday, the 22nd of September, 2014. We're going to pause and take a 5-minute break. When we return, I want to go back to this issue of pluralism again. Specifically, I want to look at some of the ingredients and some of the characteristics, if you will, of the Pluralism Project at Harvard University. I think it's extremely informative. It seems to me to raise some important issues and questions. I think we can learn a lot from it. I invite you to stay tuned. You're listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the United States Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We'll pause for a brief break. We'll be right back. Please stay with us. We'll be right back. Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome back to the Virtual Center for the Study of the United States Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It'd be good if I put my microphone on, wouldn't it? If you are just joining us, welcome to today's program. If you have been with us through our first hour, I appreciate your staying with us. I was telling Bob during the break that the introduction on religion, on separation of church and state, and dealing with diversity, the relationship between government and diversity versus unanimity, within communities is. I thought it would take about 10 minutes to make that introduction, and here we are an hour later, and we're still going on. And I've just got to. It takes me an hour to say hello. What can I tell you? It is a pleasure. I welcome you to the program if you are just joining us, and thank you if you've been with us. This is the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It is a Monday. It is the 22nd day of September. It is just gone 2 p.m. in the East, and we have a full hour to go. Our topic today is the issue of pluralism. It was, as I mentioned at the beginning, it was inspired, in my mind, by an article in this Sunday's New York Times by Thomas Friedman. And in his mind, the pluralism theme was sparked by the vote for separation that took place in Scotland this weekend. And the issue of separation versus the issue of dealing constructively and creatively with a pluralistic situation, with pluralism. It seems to me is incredibly important. And Friedman makes the point, and I'm not going to belabor this any longer, but it's very obvious that we can realize that a major problem in today's world is just this issue, and that's why I wanted to give it some more time. And that's why I wanted to look more carefully at the issue of pluralism as a way to deal with diversity. And just to quote one paragraph from Tom Friedman's article, that pluralism is more important than ever is easily divined, he says, by just looking at the Middle East. Iraq and Syria were pluralistic societies that lacked pluralism. In other words, there were societies made up of a number of different groups, but they lacked an ability to deal constructively with that situation. Their diversity, and then he gives the names that all of us are familiar with: Sunnis, Shiites, Kurds, Turkmen, Christians, Jews, Yazidis, Alawites, was something to be controlled from the top down by iron-fisted Ottomans, then by the British and French, finally by local kings and colonels. society was kept stable by a strong man. I don't have to say, because I think it's obvious, that I'm not the only one who believes, many people believe, and continue to say so, that we unleashed a firestorm in Iraq by toppling Saddam Hussein. Because whatever you might think of Saddam Hussein as a human being, the fact of the matter is his regime was able to contain and to control the situation that the world now currently finds itself confronted with. As frightening as it was for those of us who remember to live through the Cold War and the threat of nuclear war between the communist world and the free world, the fact of the matter is the world was managed and rendered somewhat stable by the Cold War. What was going to happen in the communist world when the Soviet Union was in charge was predictable. We weren't facing the unknown. We weren't facing change that we didn't expect and conceivably didn't know how to deal with. So within the apparent chaos of the Cold War world was order. Within the inhumanity and dehumanization that existed within Iraq prior to 2003 was order such as it was. James Madison, in Federalist number 10 and Federalist 51 both, makes the case that the stability and order of the nation is not threatened by the number of factions that exist in American society, but is strengthened by the existence of those factions. The more there are, the less likely there will be a majority faction. And the less likely there is a majority faction, and the more we can do to render it inoperable if there happens to be one, the more stable and secure our existing society will be. And that's the point, it seems to me, that Friedman is making in his plea and in his defense of pluralism. He makes the case that pluralism not only produces stability, it produces innovation and creativity. And I find this to be a particularly insightful issue. He says social networks and hyper-globalization are increasing the economic returns from pluralism. After all, he says, where does innovation come from? It comes from mashing up different perspectives, different ideas, and different people. Google began as a mashup between Larry Page and Sergey Brin, a Russian immigrant. The more pluralism your society has, the more trust it has. And trust plus pluralism enables people to collaborate, to spark new ideas and businesses, and comfortably reach out anywhere in the globe for the best co-creators. So in a sense, what we expect or anticipate might be a problem for innovation and creativity in our world actually is not threatened by pluralism, but is actually enhanced by it. What a concept. I think it's something we need to pursue even further than we have. Let me give you our phone number and invite you to participate in this discussion. This is an involved one. It's a heavy one. And I would welcome your participation in it. Our phone number is area code 304-574-8178. Again, that's 304-574-8178. My email address, if you'd like to communicate directly with me on this topic or other related topics, I would love to hear from you. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien906@gmail.com. I mentioned the Diversity Project at Harvard University in our first hour. Tom Friedman goes there in his article to get a little bit of the substance of what this pluralism project at Harvard is all about. I'd like to share some of this with you because I think it pretty well spells out a strategy and pretty well lays out what we need to do and why we need to do it. And again, if you go back to the 18th century, I would argue that these are insights that we can credit many of our founders, many of the framers, for being aware of and accounting for. Antonin Scalia and the originalists notwithstanding. The point that the pluralism folks make, and again, this is a project directed by Diana Eck, E-C-K. She has, and this website was posted at Harvard University in 2006, and if you look at it, it's a rich website with a lot of activities and a lot of events and a lot of involvements in other areas. The title of this particular theme is From Diversity to Pluralism. We have diversity. How do we turn that from a potential negative into a governing positive? In our first hour, we were looking at colonial America, and we were looking at the issue of religious diversity. We looked at three examples. We looked at the Bible Commonwealth, Puritan Massachusetts, in the early 17th century. We looked at Maryland, the prospective haven for Catholics in the early 17th century, and the legislation that produced religious toleration in Maryland as the only seeming solution to an emergent diversity problem between Catholics and Protestants, especially when Catholics turned out to be a minority in their own colony. For them, tolerance was the most they could hope for. And then at the end of the 17th century, we looked at the much more open situation in colonial Pennsylvania under William Penn and the emergence of the idea of separation of church and state is a way to deal with a pluralistic, religiously pluralistic environment in which Pennsylvania was settled by a variety of different religious groups. The issue here, the really telling issue for us here at the Virtual Center, I would suggest to you, is not only religious diversity. It is diversity in all of its forms. It is the potential problems to be created by a society divided on the basis of income. A society which increasingly smacks of a class system. A society in which it looks like the deck is stacked in favor of the wealthy. A society in which the few have the most and the many have the least. How do you govern and maintain stability and order in that kind of a situation? In many ways, in today's world, at least within the United States, economic diversity may be more of a problem internally within today's United States than religious diversity. But, we are not done. Because we also are confronted by the issue of ethnic and racial diversity. If peace and order and stability, the ability of people to live next door to each other and get along on a regular basis is the ideal of governance, is what governance is about, then these situations of diversity produce challenges that all of us must be aware of and all of us must address if we are to make meaningful contributions in our quest for answers to these problems. Government must address these issues. And basically, Tom Friedman's position was that that's where the United States of America deserves a feather in its cap. Because the United States has come further on the issue of pluralism in a diverse society than anything else, and than any other people. It has become the model, if you will. And that, I would suggest to you, speaks to the momentous size of this issue. Let's be real. We're not any longer just talking about pluralism within the United States. We're talking about the need to develop pluralism in the world in order to prevent people from killing each other, in order to prevent future wars. And with the potential access, the prospective access that people have to chemical and nuclear weapons and environmental disasters in the making, it is absolutely vital that we find a way to make this work. We need pluralism to work well beyond the borders of the United States of America. We need an increase in pluralism in the world. So let's look at some of the findings and some of the insights of the Pluralism Project at Harvard University. I think the first sentence pretty much sizes up what we've been saying. All of America's diversity, old and new, does not add up to pluralism. Pluralism and diversity are sometimes used as if they were synonymous. But diversity, splendid, colorful, and perhaps threatening, is not pluralism. Pluralism is the engagement that creates a common society from all that diversity. Pluralism is the glue. Pluralism is the way that different groups of people who believe and stand for different things can find common ground. That's the word that Jesse Jackson used all the time, common ground. Never mind trying to destroy what makes people different. Let's instead find a way to allow people to keep what makes them different, but still work together with us in order to subscribe to the kind of social order and stability that makes it possible for all of us to live together, work together, and learn from each other, thereby turning the differences between us from potential threats into societal assets. It seems to me that's really the challenge. And in order to do that, these folks at Harvard say, pluralism means that you have to engage diversity. You can't just leave it be as differences, because if you do, those differences are liable to create disorder and tension within your community. And that's exactly what you don't want. Example. On the same street in Silver Spring, Maryland, are a Vietnamese Catholic church, a Cambodian Buddhist temple, a Ukrainian Orthodox church, a Muslim community center, a Hispanic First Church of God, and a Hindu temple. Certainly, this is diversity. But without any engagement, without any relationship among these different groups, it may not be an example of pluralism. As standalone entities that are different, they pose more of a challenge, of a problem, than they do an asset for society, until you do something to force these separate entities to interact and engage each other. Pluralism is only one of the possible responses to this kind of diversity, the Harvard folks point out. It's not a given. It's an achievement. It's something you have to work for and constantly work on in order to make it work. Historically, this piece says, from the historical perspective, there are three ways of addressing the issue of diversity: exclusion, assimilation, pluralism. Exclusion, assimilation, pluralism. The exclusionist answer to diversity, when it seems to threaten the very core of American civilization, was to close the door to aliens, whether they be Asian, Catholics, Jews, blacks, browns, or whatever. So one way to deal with diversity is to not let any of it into your community. To build walls around your community and exclude differences in order to keep unity and community within the boundaries. Think about the issues associated with the immigration crisis on America's southern borders. Think about the history of immigration in this country. As we have seen government and public opinion shift from welcoming immigrants to passing legislation which effectively establishes quota systems. In the 1920s, there was immigration legislation passed which established a quota system. The percentage of immigrants from Northern Europe would be based on the percentage of Northern Europeans that currently made up American society. The number of immigrants that you allowed into the country from Ireland, from Scotland, from Great Britain, was dependent on the proportion of that particular group that was currently within residency in the United States. Thereby, you guaranteed that the segment of the population with the largest proportion of residents would determine the largest number of immigrants. If you look around at the percentage in the 1920s of Orientals in American society, and you insisted that that same percentage be the barometer, then what that meant was you effectively excluded Orientals from coming to the United States. And so on down the line for East Europeans and other like groups. So exclusion has traditionally been one way that we try to deal with diversity. Keep it out. Keep it away. Keep our society pure. There's a second way of dealing with diversity, and it's associated with the idea of assimilation. Assimilating diversity into mainstream society. Assimilationists are those who envisioned America to be a melting pot. You invite new immigrants to come here, but the deal is they are not to bring their differences with them. The idea is when they come to America, they are stirred up with the rest of us, and out of this comes this new thing called an American, this new creation. And so what you do by assimilating differences into mainstream society is you obliterate the differences by mandating that all the new arrivals from different places conform. They speak English. They do not have their own foreign language newspapers. They do not prominently display their own flag. In other words, everything that identifies them as something different is repressed. And everything that potentially identifies them as one of us is encouraged. That's a second way of dealing with diversity. Forcing those who are different to conform by abandoning those things which make them different. And then the third thing is pluralism. Saying to new immigrants who are willing to come to America, come as you are, with all your differences, all your different particularities, only pledging that we will all be American citizens and we will all function together as American citizens, irrespective of whatever differences there might be among us. In fact, if we are shrewd, we'll actually benefit from our differences. Think of what we can learn from each other about different cultures, about different foods from different parts of the world, about different remedies for dealing with illness and disease, about colors and designs and architecture. Think of what the promise of America can be if those who come here with all of their differences, cultural, ethnic, religious, whatever they might be, are able to bring them and contribute to the overall variety of cultural opportunities that are available in this nation. The trick, of course, is to allow these differences to prevail at the same time that commonality is being created. What that means is these different groups must engage each other. They must talk to each other. They must communicate with each other. They must have dialogue. They must not only talk, but they must listen. They won't necessarily agree on everything. There's no way they could. But what we come away with is not conformity, but an appreciation for the differences, a respect for those who are different, because we understand and we appreciate what they value as much as we hope that they will appreciate what we value. And we can coexist and live together and grow together, and at the same time benefit from the differences that each of us bring to the table. That, I would suggest to you, is pluralism. That is what makes America potentially great. We haven't solved it yet. I think Tom Friedman makes the point that Ferguson, Missouri, a couple of weeks ago, pretty much told us that we hadn't resolved it at all, really, in some areas. But we're working on it, and we know what it is. So those are the three ways of addressing the issue of diversity. The key, however, is to address those differences rather than ignore them. As long as diversity remains diversity, it remains always a potential problem. Today, the Harvard folks say, as in every era, Americans are appropriating anew the meaning of we, the people of the United States of America. What does we mean in an America of many religions? How do we relate to each other? When that we includes Buddhists, like the Hawaiian-born Buddhist astronaut who died on the Challenger, Muslim Americans, Sikh Americans, like a research scientist in Fairfax, Virginia. What exactly is pluralism? And then they go on to explain clearly what pluralism is, and I think this is incredibly important and valuable. First, they say, pluralism is not the sheer fact of diversity alone. It's the active engagement with that diversity. One can be an observer of diversity. One can celebrate diversity. One can be critical of it. One can be threatened by it. But real pluralism requires participation and engagement. Diversity can and often has meant isolation. The creation of virtual ghettos of religions and subcultures with little traffic between them. I would suggest to you that this is exclusion, this ghettoism that has been with us throughout our history, where different cultural groups live in different neighborhoods. In our big cities, we have little Italies and little Polands and little Germanys and little Russias, little Hungarys, little Czechoslovakias, if you will. The idea of engaging these diversities is what makes pluralism work. Second, pluralism is more than the mere tolerance of differences. It requires knowledge of them. Tolerance, while it's important, can be deceptive. In fact, it can stand in the way sometimes of engagement. Tolerance doesn't require people to know anything about one another. And so it can allow us to retain all of the stereotypes and all of the half-truths that we want to believe about our neighbors. You can't trust Italians. You can't trust Jews, or those kinds of stereotypes that are vicious and work against community, against a successful pluralist effort. So tolerance is fine, but tolerance means you allow people to coexist. Pluralism requires more than that. It requires that you understand them and they understand you, and you understand what you have in common as well as what you don't. And you agree to respect and appreciate both. That's the key, I would suggest. Third, these Harvard folks say, pluralism is not simply relativism, but makes room for real and different religious commitments. Some people are afraid of pluralism because they're afraid that it waters down, for example, their own religious beliefs by acknowledging that others believe differently. In other words, some people who are evangelistic believe that if I accept your religious beliefs as being legitimate, somehow it demeans mine. It kind of suggests that mine aren't as right as I always believed they were. And consequently, what people believe religiously becomes a little bit more relative and a little bit less absolute. So some people are afraid of pluralism because of this. But actually, they say, the encounter of a pluralist society is one of the genuine commitments and real differences that matter. Pluralism does not require that you relinquish the distinctiveness of your own traditions of faith and that you accept the lowest common denominator, so to speak. The difference here, the issue here, is understanding and appreciation and respect. So the danger of relativism, the danger of watering down what you believe in order to accommodate what somebody else's believes is sometimes over-dramatized and overblown. And then fourth, they make specific mention of the Constitution of the United States, specifically the First Amendment, about no establishment of religion and the free exercise of religion. The idea of pluralism does not require agreement on matters of conscience and faith. But it's basically the idea of a pluribus unum, from many comes one. And that's the issue. And then finally, the fifth element in this approach to pluralism is that it requires the nurturing of constructive dialogue in order to reveal both the understandings and the differences. Not everyone at the table will agree with everybody else. Public dialogue always leads to disagreement as well as agreement. Pluralism is not the agreement. Pluralism is the willingness to be at the table and to bring your beliefs with you. That's the key of a civil society, is a willingness to share what you believe and to listen and appreciate what others believe, and to honestly share areas on which those two areas of disagreement will never come together, as well as those areas where in certain particular places they might at some point be able to come together. Look at the situation in the Middle East right now with ISIS, whatever you would like to call it. I mean, it is the ultimate in exclusion. These people are executing any who will not conform. So it is a movement totally insistent on assimilation. In fact, there are stories in the media all the time about people from that area who were told, you have until tomorrow morning or Monday morning to agree to convert, or you will be removed. There is no way that the world can continue to exist like that. And I would suggest to you that its existence, the very existence of ISIL, might in fact be a statement about the failures that have been made in that part of the world up to this point. To allow the government of Iraq to fall into the hands of Maliki, knowing that he was not in any way inclined to work with Sunnis, but to exclude them from his government, gave ISIS a ready opportunity to appeal to the Sunnis that he refused to accept. On and on and on with this. Again, while we focus on religion, because in early America that was the major example of diversity that existed, and the legislation that was passed was designed primarily to address it, to address the issues associated with religious diversity. The fact of the matter is that as the nation developed, we ended up with challenges of economic diversity, social diversity, ethnic diversity, gender diversity. We have all been privy over the last couple of weeks, especially last week, to the disaster that has become the National Football League and the fallout associated with the Ray Rice situation and the Adrian Peterson situation in the area of child abuse. Without getting too poignant or too personal here, or too deeply into this, it's very obvious that the conversation surrounding the Ray Rice situation speaks to a reality in American society that few of us wish to condone or admit or acknowledge, but yet all of us know is there. And that is society's attitude towards women. Looked at socially, looked at historically, it doesn't, however you look at it. In terms of discrimination, in salaries, in job opportunities, in career options. Counselors in our schools were encouraged, were trained to channel female students into the appropriate areas reserved for females. Catching a husband, getting married, having kids, not working, suspending your career to stay home and raise your family. And all of these things. And unfortunately, I know here in southern West Virginia, we have a women's resource center for abused women that literally has standing room only. Because it seems like, as a culture, as a society, we have to deal with this idea ingrained in our culture that somehow it's acceptable for men to knock women around. And of course, people will go all the way back to Scripture in order to justify it. God created women to serve man. And on and on and on. But the fact of the matter is, if we spent our time in our schools teaching children what being human means, and teaching children to respect other people as human children of God, worthy of the respect that status entitles all of us, then I would suggest to you that we would begin to make inroads into a situation that produces a Ray Rice kind of situation. In fact, I would suggest, and this is kind of getting off on a tangent here, and I don't want to do that right at the end of our program. We only have about 3 minutes left in today's program. But I would suggest to you that if more of our educational system was focused on what it means to be human and the respect that all humans are due because they are human beings, we would relieve and resolve an awful lot of problems in our nation, in our world. Unfortunately, we've not been willing in a serious way to address these issues. Under the the very suspicious, dubious heading of due process, we have found ways to justify treatment of other human beings that, it seems to me, raises serious questions about our own humanity, our own right to be considered human beings. Because if we really knew and appreciated the value of human life, all human life, it seems to me we would not only be better able to deal with those who violate human life, we would actually begin to turn around and begin to address the issue of why, in fact, some people don't respect other people at all. People, human beings who respect other human beings and respect life, are required to do and not do certain things when dealing with other human beings. If we really respect the humanity of others, there are certain things that we do today in today's world that we would never again do. And I feel that all of this is really critically important in understanding the issue of governance. And there's absolutely no question that I believe that Madison was correct, that in order to govern effectively in a changing environment, government must be adaptable. And what being adaptable means is recognizing the changed circumstances surrounding issues related to diversity and being willing to make the kind of accommodations and the kind of changes necessary to assimilate, to bring, to include everybody into the body politic and to exclude nobody. I would suggest to you slavery was a mechanism designed to exclude a certain group of people from inclusion. Marriage, as traditionally viewed by a lot of people, is a way to establish a sort of class system within institutions. And on and on and on. All of these we must address in order to deal with the problems of our nation and our world in the 21st century. It is moving towards 59 minutes after the hour, and our time together is done for today. I want to thank you very much for being with us here at the Virtual Center for the study of the Constitution and civic responsibility. I hope that you'll be able to join us tomorrow's program will begin 1/2 hour later. We'll begin at 1:30 in the East. The program will be only 90 minutes long rather than the full 120 minutes. This is Bill O'Brien. Please be safe. Enjoy your evening. But we'd like to see you back with us again. Thank you.